welcome to this special edition of Catholic Current. From Washington, D.C., I'm Mara Moser. As the nation marks its 250th year, we are discussing and celebrating the contributions of Catholics to this nation. Today with us is Dr. Michael Breidenbach from Ave Maria University. He is an historian and author on American religion, politics, and culture, including the book Our Dear-Bought Liberty, on how Catholics helped shape the American founding. Welcome, Michael. You know, we are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and your book, Our Dear-Bought Liberty, talks about the role of Maryland Catholics in the American founding. Can you start by telling us what Catholic life was like at the time of the founding, and what was the place of Catholics in colonial American society?
That's a great question. As we celebrate the 250th anniversary of America, I think we should also celebrate Catholics at the colonial era and at the American founding, their important contributions that they made to the country, and then in turn, how America shaped them. Colonial life as a Catholic ought to have been a quiet one. You didn't want to be very vocal about your Catholicism. And indeed, in some colonies, it was illegal to publicly worship as a Catholic. And so oftentimes, even in Maryland, which was established as a colony very favorable to Catholics, even having a Catholic at its head, one had to live a quiet life as a Catholic. So most of the time, Catholics revolved around Pennsylvania and Maryland. These are the two most religiously tolerant colonies where Catholics often lived. And so even in those places, Catholics lived a fairly quiet life, practicing the sacraments when priests were available. There were very limited options for priests and parishes, and having a devotionary if you were literate, and frequenting the sacraments at least once or twice a year if a priest was able to ride in his horse and come and distribute the sacraments. So it was not like today where we have a plethora of mass times to go to and online resources for Catholics. It was a rather limited and quiet experience for most Catholics.
Do we know much about their religious practice? What might their devotional life look like?
So we do have really rich treasures that you can find in museums like at the Baltimore Basilica. They'll have these on display, and I encourage your viewers to go there. We have several catechesis books, devotionaries, certainly the Bible. If you could afford books and could read, those would be offered to you. Devotion to the Pope was alive, but many people wouldn't have known what the Pope looked like, would not really read encyclicals like we have now, or have sort of lots of broadcasts of what the Holy See is doing. So the devotion would typically be reading the Bible, attending Mass, frequenting the sacraments when you could. And the sermons, the excellent sermons we have are, for instance, from Bishop John Carroll, the first Catholic bishop. And the sermons that I've read from him are often very catechetical. So they focus on a virtue, whether it's a natural virtue like temperance or a theological virtue like charity, very much rooted in the scripture. So taking a kind of core text from the reading of that day and then expounding on it. You don't get a lot of sense that Bishop Carroll, for instance, had a lot of anecdotes that he presented. Oftentimes priests will do that at the pulpit. It was very sort of, I would say, kind of by the book, really making sure that people are living a virtuous and holy life. And there weren't a lot of sort of third order lay movements, or there were a few sort of sodalities to Mary that I found. But in general, it's a fairly bare-boned kind of Catholicism, because they didn't have a lot of resources, very few priests. But this changes, thankfully, over on, especially in the 19th century.
Yeah, for sure. So people who live in Maryland are familiar with the names of prominent Catholic families. You mentioned Archbishop Carroll, but there are many families in this area. Who were these people, and what motivated them as they shaped the Maryland colony?
So I think the big names are Calvert and Carroll. Those are the two main figures of dynasties, really, in Maryland history, generally, but also, of course, in Catholic history. Uh, let's talk about George Calvert. He was the first Lord Baltimore, and after which the city is named, of course. And he was the one who convinced the king in England to grant a charter to him for effectively ownership, as he saw it, over this land that he called Mary's Land, right? Maryland, which was named after the current queen at the time, who was in turn named after Our Lady. And so there's a sense here in which George Calvert, who never set foot on Maryland, he died before the Maryland Charter was signed, but he was a Catholic from birth, basically since his early baptism, but then he had to conform to the Church of England at the time in England. And it was only later in his life, when he was at the height of his political power in England, serving the king, that he actually reverted back to Catholicism. And this, of course, meant that he could not have any of the political posts that he had occupied because it was illegal for a Catholic to do so. But the king has wanted to honor his great service, and so he gave Maryland as a kind of consolation to him. So that gives us a window into the blurry lines between the Church of England and Catholicism. There's a sense here in which everything is kind of up for grabs. Like, what does it mean to be a Catholic in a Protestant empire? And the Calverts in particular are interested in that question because they have a colony that's meant to be for Catholics as well as Protestants. So the Calverts are interesting for this very, very tight balance between being loyal to the king and being faithful to their Catholicism. And what this kind of results in, effectively, is a colony that doesn't have an established church, but it has a priest that comes on the first ships that come to Maryland, the Ark and the Dove. Father Andrew White, a Jesuit, and his companion come to St. Mary's City, they called it, and celebrate the first Mass in what became the 13 original colonies. At the same time, there are Protestants. So they're really trying to make a more tolerant colony. And the Carrolls continue that legacy. They want to be fervently Catholic, but also be in a society where there are other Christians getting along together, but trying to overturn some of the disabilities that they felt that they had in terms of not being able to hold public office, being double taxed on their estates, and other sort of discrimination laws. So what they want by the time we get to the American founding is a free exercise of religion. And so to be a Catholic in the colonial era is one in which, as I said, a kind of quiet life, but these prominent Catholics cannot live a quiet life. These are the ones who have to be sort of outspoken as Catholics and try to use the political power and the financial power that they have, because they're very wealthy, to shape the laws and the culture.
So we know Catholics were sometimes seen as a problem for the American Republic because they were thought to have divided loyalties. There was a question of whether they would be loyal to the Pope in Rome or to the Republic. Why was that such a key issue, and how did the Carrolls address it?
So that is the central question. If you ask sort of your Protestant who's ruling England, right, as a parliamentarian or even the king, what's the problem with Catholics? They would say they have divided loyalties. And what they meant by that is they have not just a private religion where they go to church and receive the sacraments. They have apparently a religion where you have to have a certain, not just deference or devotion or love for the Pope, but a kind of juridical, kind of legal dependence on the Pope as a foreign prince. So that's how they understood it, that the Pope had this kind of power over them in even civil affairs, political affairs. Now, there's some historical evidence to suggest that they were not wrong in thinking that. For instance, popes had annulled civil laws in England. The one pope had annulled, meaning it's null and void, the Magna Carta. one of the founding constitutional documents in English history. So the worry would be that you would have a citizen or a subject of the king who also is divided in their loyalty to the Pope. So that's the kind of the central problem. And one of the problems for Maryland Catholics in particular, or any Catholics going to English colonies in North America, is that people who wanted to set sail from London, for instance, to the New World as they saw it, they had to sign an oath of allegiance. And this oath basically said, I'm allegiant to the king and his successors, and I don't believe the Pope has this kind of power, the power to tell, his subjects to try to kill the king or something like this, or that he can intervene in the temporal affairs of our country. Now, the Pope said, if you sign this oath, there would be penalties against you, effectively. It's not okay to sign this oath. Whereas if you don't sign the oath, then you're not pledging allegiance to the king. So it's a terrible choice, or to be an English Catholic. So you can either be a suspected traitor or not in the good graces of the king, to say the least. So the Calverts have to solve this problem. And what I found in the archives in London is that they created their own oath of allegiance. And they were trained as lawyers, so what they did is just cut out all the clauses that were problematic. And what's remaining is just, I'm allegiant to the king and his successors. And that was their kind of political legal solution, and it worked. I mean, Catholics came to Maryland. There wasn't a concern about their loyalties to the king, and there wasn't concern about their Catholicism. So that was a kind of settlement there. But that old argument that the Catholics have divided loyalties continues. It continued to the 19th century. It continued until John F. Kennedy.
That's right, yeah.
Right, when he was running for president. Like, are you going to be an American president? Or are you going to have is the Pope going to have your ear all the time? And so that's an enduring question. But the Calverts and the Carrolls basically say, in matters of political affairs, it's the American Republic that has the power, or the colony, in the case of the colonial era. And in the case of ecclesiastical affairs, that's the jurisdiction of the Pope. And that was their solution. And I think you find that in the U.S. Constitution. I think you have that kind of divided jurisdiction.
Yeah, they felt the tension, but they were able to solve that creatively. What are some of the key ways that Catholics had an influence on religious freedom in the United States?
Well, very practically speaking, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, one of the famous Catholics in this story, who was the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence, he was on the final committee that drafted the First Amendment. So we don't know what happened in that committee. There are no documents that survive for historians to look at. But what we do know is that he was there. And I think merely his presence on that committee, I think, was meaningful. In other words, he represents someone that could not hold an office in Parliament in Britain during that time and would continue not to into the 19th century. He represented someone who had, whose faith had been considered to be dangerous until proven loyal. So the fact that he was on that committee, I think, speaks volumes to the general tenor of the American founding, which is simply that, especially for Christians, that they would have the free exercise of religion. They could openly worship in public, right? They wouldn't have to have underground churches or be penalized for attending Mass, for instance, or the sacraments. So I think that's meaningful. And John Carroll, the first bishop, also writes pamphlets and tries to influence the Constitutional Convention about the no religious test for public office. So that's in our Constitution. We don't have a religious test for public office. Anyone who's a U.S. citizen and other eligibility criteria can hold public office duly elected. That wasn't the case in Britain. You'd have to conform to the established church. And John Carroll writes in newspapers around the time of the Constitutional Convention and the ratifying conventions, arguing against religious tests. So there's a kind of confluence of factors there. And the last influence, I would say, is that there were two other Catholics in the constitutional making. Their names were Daniel Carroll and Thomas Fitzsimmons from Pennsylvania. Daniel Carroll was the brother of John Carroll, and they are members of Congress. In other words, they are freely duly elected members. And so if you prohibit Catholics from holding public office, that's rather awkward. You already have representatives who are Catholic there. So there's a sense here in which Catholics have a seat at the table. And merely that fact alone is significant. But I have to think that in the conversations that were not recorded or transcribed for us, that there were other ways in which these Catholics influenced people like John Adams, who called Charles Carroll a Catholic yet a zealous patriot, right? So he feels a tension, right? It's strange that a Catholic would be a patriot in his estimation, um, but so it is. And so they even send him to Canada as a delegate of Congress to try to win over the Canadians. So they trust him. They are trusted Catholics.
Yes, you could see how their legacy endures today. What about outside of Maryland? Were there other places where Catholics influenced the culture at the time of the founding?
Yes, and in fact, some of the influence happens in England and France. So this is a global colonial experience. The founding is a global phenomenon. There are people not just from England, people from Ireland, France, the German states. Um, we have people from the Caribbean. We have enslaved Catholics. So there's all sorts of influences here that make up the Catholic Church. And there's literature coming from England that American Catholics are receiving. There's certainly letters from Bishop Carroll back and forth to the Vatican. So there's all sorts of influences. I would say the biggest influence simply is the sacraments, right? There's a sense here in which this is the Latin liturgy and everything's in Latin, the sense in which it's part of a global church. So that's all coming from mostly Europe. And all the European Catholics are immigrating, those coming from the Caribbean, those coming from the Spanish colonies in the South. They are shaping the American Catholic Church with those influences. So that comes from the liturgy, devotionaries, and literature.
Something we are reflecting on in this series is the way that Catholicism has enriched the life of this nation, some of which you just described, but also how the American experience has influenced the Catholic Church. How does looking at the founding help us with this reflection?
That's a great question. I think it's a two-way street, right? And so maybe three ways. The first way is you look at the way that American politics is structured is very different at the time of the founding and now than monarchies, right? Most people are coming from states with a monarch. Now they're entering a state that's a republic. Elected officials, we the people. That fundamentally changes political culture and how people think about their stake in society. And that definitely has, I think, an influence on the American Catholic Church. So, for instance, when you go to that Baltimore Basilica, you'll notice that it is not your Gothic European church structure, right? And Benjamin Henry Latrobe was the architect for this, and he gave Bishop Carroll and his trustees two different designs. One was this kind of like neo-Gothic style that you would find in Europe. The other was a neo-Roman style. And that's effectively what we have today. When you enter the sort of portico and the narthex, these are Roman columns, like Greco-Roman columns. You have this kind of oculus and kind of dome, very reminiscent of Greco-Roman architecture. This was a conscious choice, I think, on Carroll's part. He wants to say, we use the same architect that redesigned the US Capitol. We are using the same style that we'll find in Washington, D.C. and New York, and so that Greco-Roman style. We want to be part of this political, sort of political culture, right? We want to be seen as sort of congruent with American political culture, not something other, right? That would really distinguish ourselves from the four walls. Once you come inside, it's very different, right? It's the Mass, it's the sacraments. That's distinctive. So that's the first thing. The second is the liturgy. Bishop Carroll writes to someone in England, a man named Joseph Barrington, who's an English priest, and he said, maybe it would be better actually if we had the vernacular liturgy. In other words, English or German or French, rather than Latin. I mean, this is a pretty radical idea, and he thinks it wouldn't have traction, right? But he gets a sense that this would actually help with evangelization, especially those who are less educated. And he even explicitly says sort of poor people or enslaved Catholics, so they could better enter into. But I think he has in mind basically anyone, because very few people know Latin. And so I think the kind of diversity that you see in America leads to this suggestion that we might have a vernacular liturgy. We see that obviously in Vatican II. Right. Speaking about Vatican II, the third thing I would say is on the question of religious liberty. So when we look at the Second Vatican Council, one of the major advisors was John Courtney Murray, an American Jesuit. And he suggested that the American experiment in religious liberty really is something that the global Catholic Church should consider. And so what we see in Dignitate Humanae, this final declaration on religious liberty document, we don't see John Courtney Murray, I think, very much in that document, but we do see as an openness to a redescription of liberty that I think is very consonant with the American experiment. So those are just three ways I think the way that America kind of influenced the global Catholic Church.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Michael, is there anything you would like to add? Anything we haven't touched upon that you want to make sure that we convey today?
Sure. Well, as we celebrate the 250th anniversary on 4th of July, I think American Catholics should take stock, not just in the incredible journey that America has gone from a colonial experiment in which people risked their lives, frankly, to come to the colonies and build teetering settlements and, trying to make their way in a foreign land, to the many arduous journeys from that point until today, but also the way in which Catholics were not just sort of often perceived as foils to American founding, that were sort of like the other, sort of almost the enemy, the papists, as Protestants might call Catholics in early America, but actually founders and framers, right? Not just foreigners, but founders and framers. And I think that's meaningful when we look at the way that the parishes have flourished, right, over time, the way that Catholics have been able to be influential in every branch of federal government. This is because of the groundwork that pioneers and missionaries did 250 plus years ago. And I think it would be worth going to some of these museums, but going to St. Augustine, Florida, come to my state, and see the Spanish story, going to the Baltimore Basilica Museum, and really seeing that we are living, as it were, in their shadow.
It's beautiful. Thank you very much, Michael. Appreciate having you here with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us for this special edition of Catholic Current. You can find out more about our ongoing celebration of America at 250 by visiting us online at usccb.org or follow us on social media at USCCB. I'm Maura Moser. See you next time.